coming out here tonight. When I first decided about a year ago that I was going to put together a narrative collection, I had the idea for some time, but I needed something a little bit more in order to make it work as a concrete collection as opposed to just an assembly of individual pieces. And at the time I'd been reading a lot of contemporary poetry, trying to broaden my horizons a bit. Between all of the amazing work that I found, I kept finding myself frustrated with the cynicism on display in some of these books, the self-aggrandizement, the emotional manipulation, and what personally affected me the most, the misery contest, this idea that there's a positive correlation between how sad a work of fiction is and how much value it has. And things like that really frustrated me when I was reading this. So in a sense, this book is kind of a reactionary process for me. I wanted to try and find some sort of line, I guess, between expression and manipulation, and how that way of thinking influences the writing process. So, with that in mind, this first poem here is called Influence A. Chinese takeaways provide an endless source of free newspapers. Mum encouraged me to read at every turn, her logic being that I couldn't know my worldview without first viewing the world, and print takes just a bit more thought than colours pumped into your eyeballs, filling in your greys. I like to play a game with those I trust, wherein we read the first 5 pages to each other, deadpan, and listen for inflections that betray agendas we would otherwise prefer not to display. The front page is a toddler's day trip in his sister's dress, how brave he is, how we should love him. The second is a doctor whose potential cure for Werdnig-Hoffmans could become reality by 2022. The third is for an actress down on her luck, showing some cleavage. A veteran's descent into dementia spirals down the no-man's land of middle pages, lost in folds, but some guy who found a hair in his bread roll can get a paragraph under the bombings in Paris. Findings thus far seem to indicate The Guardian is bollocks, and the Daily Mail is a borderline carcinogen, but this is why we play the game, to see things from a light beyond our own. A past acquaintance claimed he had no bias. He saw only a sequence of events, apparently. This exercise was wasted on him. Only fools are shackled to mundane priorities, he said. It's worth mentioning that he liked Ayn Rand, and my acquaintance was honestly an idiot. Thank you. So this next poem, going back to what I was talking about trying to broaden my horizons with new poetry, I went to a book launch, beginning of this year actually, and it should have been a really good affair. There were a lot of really talented writers on display, and that's the sort of thing that you need to see nowadays, is new people getting exposure as opposed to the same 5 people over and over again. But it was actually the audience who really struck a chord with me at that event. I felt the need to write about it, so this next poem is called Reverence. Writers sit like woodpeckers in coffee shops, all sudden looks and twitchy feet. You're either 25 or want to be at these events, where name drops fall like cigarettes and every guest has pictures of their famous friends, studied philosophy at famous school in place exotic. Are you a poet too? No, I'm here because I missed my shot of self-aggrandizement this week and felt like catching up. They watch in reverence, waiting for a bow, eyes awake for weakness in the publisher's defense, and I think secretly they all hate poetry. They've been dreaming about dreaming of this. Thank you. So at the heart of it, this is a narrative collection. Chapter 2 is largely dedicated to my time living in Hampshire, and it was an incredibly influential period of my life for me, partly because that's when I discovered poetry, but also because it was one of those time periods that really shaped who I've become as a human being. And I was actually engaged for a period of time, and the fact that I'm standing here today kind of tells you how that worked out. But it does come up in this collection, and this next poem is about an afternoon that we spent in the Winchester Water Meadows. So this is Meadow Song. We took a day away from city life to drown ourselves in protest. A winding trail by the old mill gave us shelter down a Hampshire mile, where the countryside hummed cricket songs and damsels coupled in mid-flight at waterside, intoxicated by their summer's hiding place, a church for godless folk and tweedy painters. This picture goes out to the westward guest, trendy little thing, first to say I love you and expect the phrase to be returned. I blink and she's still here. We're standing at the altar, covering our ears, disregarding our abrasions in the hopes they won't turn septic, deliberating over what to name our dogs. I blink twice and she is gone. My fingers tingle between 2 and 4, thin survivors severed from the burden of a handheld promise in a broken glass ring that looks the same today. A trophy from the war we watched on television, slumped across the sofa, padding out our runtime. I look back and think we could have shared a life together. I take stock and I remember that we could have died alone. Thank you. So you'll notice there my phonetic slip, saying think as opposed to think. I did not grow up in Hampshire, I grew up in South London, and unfortunately these things do tend to slip through from time to time. One thing that always stuck out to me actually when I moved to Hampshire was how people react to hearing where you're from. There's always that conversation among new students, especially where did you come from, etc. And I'd mention where I grew up in, and they'd always pull that face as if someone farted in the room. So this next poem is kind of inspired by these consistent reactions. This is "Don't Tell Me About Croydon." The name alone promotes a sneer, emanates a greasy smell, denotes a dip in quality of life. In my younger years, we held a badge of honour. Knife crime capital of the UK, voted second worst to live in by our local paper. God save the first. A moment's silence for my hometown harbour, a community defined by tram lines, the wild youth, buses bound for rehabilitation, an easy immigration centre and the moon people at shelters. They change inconsequentially. Tracksuits moulded into bone and accents that lean over to one side, segregated by the stitches keeping east and west conjoined. Poor people go here, better offs go over there. Lift the slab and they crawl out, woodlice hiding from the sun in search of a delusion or a dream, in a place where even pigeons kill themselves, halos in the concrete, shredded by the passing tires. So this next poem, I should probably get this one out of the way now. I mentioned again, going back to kind of exploring more contemporary poets, there was a particular book that I picked up, and I knew nothing about it before. I just saw the cover and it looked interesting to me. And I sat down and read it in my local library, and I was quite stunned, actually, by how awful I thought it was. It really struck me as being not only bad poetry, but very uneducated poetry, written by someone who had an idea of what they wanted poetry to be, but not necessarily what poetry could, should, or has been. And it did leave quite an impression on me, actually. It's not very often I read something and hate it that much. And then I went online and I found that it's one of the most commercially successful books of the past few years, so that was fun. It really bothered me in a sense because I knew why people liked it, and I felt like people liked it for very shallow reasons, so I felt the need to write about it. This is Soybeans and Sorbitol. I want to apologise for all the poetry she has called poetry. What we have here, people of the jury, is an act of fraud, a shameless compilation of quotations dedicated to the ego, masquerading as an art form older than her arguments. This literary politician, so embroidered in the expectations of her shallow base, left poetry for dead, skinned, stabbed and beaten in the decade's alley, and wears its corpse like leather from a sacred cow, protected by her place in history and followers too blind to see there is a formula at play. Give them validation, some black and white stills implying a familiar tragedy, 4 or 5 lines of lowercase denial set to glorify the modern outcast, safe behind a blanket of anxiety, and wait for the awards. It has become a mantra. You are fierce, now buy my book. You are strong, follow my Twitter. You are beautiful no matter what they say. Good girl, that's right. Now fetch the ball and bring it back. And they buy into it. Why read Wendy Cope or Warson Shire if they won't praise you so incessantly? Thank you. Now this book is called Keep It in the Family, and it's called Keep It in the Family for a reason. It's because not only is this book about lying, but it is confessional in the sense that this is a story that I feel very strongly about, and I wanted to explore the idea of what kind of decisions when you're growing up, when you're in your formative years, make you want to become a writer? What inspires you to be essentially a professional liar? And I do write a lot about my family in this collection, so these next couple are going to be dedicated to them and to the environment that shaped me, essentially. So this first one is called Hold the Line. We all see the signs. She huddles in increasing layers, cardigans to hide a healthy shine, summer sleeves to mask the marks across her collarbone, her wrists. The walls aren't quite as thick as they once were. Rest assured, my father never hit me growing up. He only hits the ones who can't hit back. Mother calls to say our dog is at the vet's today, tending to a broken leg. She says he twisted it while he was running. We arrange a meeting for next Sunday morning and she holds the line. I offer to come home instead. She says there is no need. It's 2012. She's showing more. Her pride is tangible as she recounts her routine of antagonizing him. The night that she compared my father to his own, the silly face he made when he went through the ceiling. I refrain from asking if she'll count the bruises this time. Harry Chapin comes to visit and I fold over the desk. I often wonder how it starts, why hands turn into fists, who else knows but keeps their anger confidential, how much I would sacrifice to poison him because I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Thank you. While I was living in Hampshire, and even to an extent now, I've kept what I call a memory box. So just exactly what it sounds like, just a way of me collating all these important moments in my life over the last few years so I can look back on them and maybe try and understand them from a new perspective. So this poem largely came about as a result of that. This is Leftovers. Underneath the bed frame rests a shoebox full of throwaway tat, crap prescribed a value based on who delivered it, if it's sustainable or fossil fuel, if the crap giver is absent or deceased, if I care either way. I use a shoebox because shoes are meant for travelling, and in my head this sounded like a good reason until I wrote it down. That one love letter lives in there, diluted by thesaurus syndrome and some awkward turns of phrase, but A for effort. Let's be generous for days gone by. When we tanked, when I was no longer the most amazing man in the world, it went in the shoebox. Underneath the ornaments, newspaper clippings and a dozen foreign coins. My second letter landed on its feet, beautiful and raw, and straight into the box. Provisions for the day my name, or hers, can be replaced. I keep them all together. In time they might eventually fuse and form a statue or memorial. A piece of my maternal granddad lines the floor. He used to call me wee man late into my teens, and by the time he died he wanted nothing more than to be scattered by the wife he couldn't love. His name was Frank. Towards the end, his hands had vertigo, so the leftovers look more like Frank. Thank you. And this next poem is going to be for a rather important member of my family, I think. This is simply titled For the Member Who Can't Read. Mother found you at the kennels, returned 3 times and scheduled for execution. Your name was Freddy number 2. We thought Ben would suit you better. Later you turn into Ben Dog, the collie Labrador with cotton socks, protector of the small and weak, a black and white brick shithouse on 4 stumpy legs. My mother would have died without you. You brought happiness into a joyless family, made my months in solitary seem benign, brought credence to the theory that you popped into reality to save us. You're fading now, greying in the chops, and I cannot apologize enough for what you had to see. You cannot read this, but I hope you like your name, and I promise I will wait with you when you are leaving. Thank you. This last one, because I know I'm pushing my luck slightly with time, is, again, I quite enjoy doing sequences of poems, and in a narrative collection especially, I think it's quite important to have a sense of continuity, the idea that there is an actual narrative here as opposed to you just blithering off every event in your life. So this is part of what I suppose you'd call the engagement series. This is Fetish. My guest alighted on the Basingstoke line. We smiled, though we didn't want to smile. and I couldn't help but hate her for exhibiting our amethyst fixation and that stupid fucking hat. Thank you.